Hello, welcome to the tutorial for Visualization, Analysis, and Design. I am Tamara Munsner. We're going to start out with the first half where we first talk about an analysis framework for visualization with the what, why, how framework. We'll talk about visually encoding data with marks and channels, and then ways to use spatial position to communicate the three major kinds of data: tabular data, spatial data, and network data. Then in the second half, we'll move on to talk about color and other visual channels, and then interactivity. So how to manipulate a single view by changing or selecting items or navigating, how to use multiple views, faceting by juxtaposing side-by-side views, partitioning into those views, superimposing layers on top of each other, and then reducing the amount of data we show in a single view with filtering and aggregation. So let's get started. Defining visualization, which I'm going to abbreviate as Viz. My current favorite definition is computer-based visualization systems provide visual representations of data sets designed to help people carry out tasks more effectively. So why do I define it in this way? Let's dig in. Why is it important that we have data and people in the same sentence? Why do we need a human in the loop? Now, my answer is that visualization is suitable when there's a need to augment the capabilities of humans, rather than simply replace them with a completely computational decision-making method. So we don't need Viz if there is a fully automatic solution and we trust it. But there's many situations where that's not the case. It could be that there's many analysis problems and it's ill-specified which of them you want to answer. You don't know which of hundreds or even thousands of things that you would write a specific program for you'd want to do in advance. Visualization is often used in long-term contexts for end users indefinitely, as in when you're doing exploratory analysis and scientific data. It's also the case that you might be presenting something you know rather than exploring what you don't know. That's very common in situations like data journalism, say the Upshot in the New York Times. Visualization sometimes is trying to work itself out of a job. It could be a stepping stone to something. It could be that you're trying to develop a model, but you're not even there yet. You have to understand the data set and develop requirements for it. It could be that you're working on an automatic solution that's not yet done. Maybe you're refining it or trying to set parameters. Maybe you're already in possession of an automatic solution, but you want to actually, before deployment, verify that you believe it's correct, or even after deployment, continue monitoring it for an indefinite period of time. Here's another question. Why do we want visual representations? Turns out those are part of the general class of external representation, getting things out of your head into something external to your own head. And the play with visualization is to replace cognition with perception whenever that's possible. So let's, for example, think of this table of numbers. It happens to be measurements of how much genes are turning on or turning off at specific time points in response to an experimental condition versus a control condition. Now, if I ask you things like, well, what's happening between these time points? Are we seeing differences between the experiment and the control conditions? It's really hard to answer that. Of course, you're capable of reading a single number and then reading the next number and then reading the next number, but trying to keep track of those in your head as you get to number 17 and number 36 and keeping track of all of that, we just completely don't have the capacity to do that. That takes a lot of cognitive resources. If instead, what we replace this with is a visualization where we've encoded those numbers, in this case as colors on a divergent color scale, now what we're seeing is we've actually laid out the relationships between genes. We've color-coded each one of these time points in experimental conditions, and we can see in the first column in the first hour, the control condition and the experimental condition on the bottom are roughly the same. Even in the second column at the time point 2, but in that third column, we're really seeing a discrepancy where there's a lot more green on the top compared to red. That's actually showing us that there are differences significantly between those conditions, and one is upregulated in terms of genetic expression. And then back in the last condition, we're once again seeing that they're roughly the same. That kind of judgment call we were able to do because we swapped in perception for cognition, freeing up our cognitive resources for higher level questions, perhaps about the underlying biological questions instead of simply comparing things down at the raw number level. Why do we want to represent all the data? Why aren't statistical summaries good enough? Well, summaries are crucial, but they do lose information, and there's many contexts where the details do matter. We might want to confirm whether what we expected is what we're seeing, or find something we didn't expect, or assess whether the model we're using is appropriate for our data. There's a great example called Anscombe's Quartet, made by a statistician in the early 70s, and 4 data sets with identical mean and variation in X and in Y. So we can't tell them apart from the summary statistics, but the instant we look at them, we clearly can tell them apart. One is a very standard distribution. One, we see it's clearly nonlinear as opposed to linear, so maybe some assumptions are being violated of a model. One, we see that that slope line isn't quite right because of the outlier. One, we see that the slope line is completely misleading because of this very specific situation that was created with the synthetic data. Now, the problem is it only gets worse. This is 20 static data points. What about as our number of data points grow into the thousands or even the hundreds of thousands? What about as our data is varying dynamically? What about as we have a heterogeneous collection of different kinds of data, from tables to networks to spatial data? So that complexity, we often actually want a human to look at it and try to make a judgment call based on the rich complexity of the data, not just the summaries. We will be using statistics along the way, but we often want to dive in and see things at the next level of detail down. So what is the benefit of analyzing visualization? Let's have a quick peek at that before we actually see the entire analysis framework. We have value in imposing structure on a truly enormous design space that it gives you a scaffold to think systematically about a whole series of choices. I think of analysis as a stepping stone where if you analyze existing, it helps you design something new, better and more effectively. Speaking of effective, the tricky thing and the reason visualization is so difficult is that most possibilities of how to draw some sort of hopefully meaningful picture, unfortunately are ineffective for some particular combination of task and data. So let's look at these 2 examples as a quick foray into the space. We're going to look at space tree and tree juxtaposer. These are both systems that are actually for looking at large and complex trees. In fact, we're looking at trees of evolutionary relationships between species that are actually hundreds of thousands of nodes in this large graph of species relationships. Now, if all we look at is the raw pixels, what we can see is, well, they're different, but that's not very helpful. So what if we try to decompose? So in terms of what data are we looking at? In this case, they're both trees. In terms of why are we looking at it, let's posit that we're trying to actually go through and locate and identify things, in particular, a path between one node at the leaf of the tree all the way up to the root. How are we doing this? Well, they're both visually encoding data. We're seeing pixels. They both have some built-in way to navigate around a complex structure. They both allow us to select a specific node, but then they diverge. With space tree, as soon as we've selected, in this case, mammals, we've filtered out many other things, and we're aggregating and showing these little triangular glyphs showing the things that have been collapsed down to get out of the way and avoid clutter. In tree juxtaposer, something else happens after selection. We actually change the spatial layout by rearranging what we see here to make room to see some parts of the tree with this stretch and squish navigation technique. Some expands and then others contract to make room. The point being, now we can think more systematically about the similarities and differences here. So let's actually walk through this analysis framework. There's 4 levels and 3 questions. So at the 4th top level, we'll start by thinking about a specific application domain, a domain situation. There are target users they might have expertise, there might be domain-specific conventions about how they're used to seeing their data. So this question of who are the target users, what are their expectations, what are their needs, a very user-centered design way of thinking about the world. But then we have to keep going. We have to go from the domain level to the abstraction level, because what we want to do is translate from domain-specific language to a more generic language that lets us reason about visualization. And this vocabulary of viz might help us see that there could be commonalities between people in 2 completely different domains, like finance and astrophysics. Maybe even though they use really different language for what they're talking about, maybe they're fundamentally doing the same thing from a visualization point of view. And so the only way we could be able to reason about that instead of doing ad hoc solutions for every single new problem is if we do have these abstractions that we can really think about. So the two abstractions we're going to focus on are what is being shown, which we're calling the data abstraction, and why is the user looking at it, which we'll call the task abstraction. So we have this challenge of coming up with domain agnostic ways of talking about these things. And then the next level down is what I call the idiom level. Some people call this the technique level. And the question is, how is it being shown? And we can often separate out the question of visual encoding, how are we drawing it? That might be static, from the interaction idiom, how are we interactively manipulating that drawing? Sometimes those are combined together, but sometimes they're separable. And finally, we have this fourth level, the algorithm level, where we can think about efficient computation. Now, the reason there's benefit in separating into these levels is because there's threats to validity that are very different at each of these four levels. So what can you get wrong at the domain level? You could misunderstand what they mean. What could you get wrong at the abstraction level? Maybe what you're showing them isn't the right thing. Part of the data abstraction process is not just to draw what you're given, but possibly to transform the data guided by your understanding of the task so that you are actually then able to, once you have the correct data abstraction, in fact, visually encoding that could actually help them. But if you're showing them the wrong thing, then the best visual encoding in the world can't solve their problem. Now at the idiom level, how could we get it wrong? Well, we could just do something that does not work with the human perceptual system. There are many, many pitfalls there because people are tricky. Finally, at the algorithm level, the threat to validity is you could have, say, code that's too slow. Now, the key thing is we want to use appropriate methods for validating at each of these levels, because what we really need are different fields with methodology that are appropriate for each of these. For instance, in the computer science department, typically algorithmic benchmarking is well taught. You can do a computational benchmark, you can measure the system time and memory. For the more theoretically inclined people, you could analyze the computational complexity. So these are appropriate methods for trying to figure out if your algorithm is actually doing the right thing. A lot of this so-called technique-driven work is at the heart of visualization, and there's a huge amount of it. But that's not the only thing we have. What about questions at the idiom level? How do you figure out if you got the idiom right? It's not enough to simply prove that your computer runs fast. What if you're drawing it in a way that doesn't work for human perception? We can use methods out of design, for example, explicitly creating alternatives. And for understanding whether or not things are effective for humans, we often use methods out of cognitive psychology of measuring humans using a system in a lab where we're actually measuring with a stopwatch how long it took them to do something and did they make errors. And that kind of analysis, we typically use methods out of cognitive psychology. Now, those methods are great for trying to figure out if the encoding worked, but they're actually terrible for figuring out if you got the abstraction right. Because when you do those lab studies with your stopwatch, you tell the person what to do. But then how do you know if they really do what you think they do? That's where we want to get methods out of anthropology and ethnography, where we actually need to use sort of field observation. So we need to observe people, we need to talk to them in their natural settings. And what we typically do is deploy systems and then watch how it changes behavior directly in the wild, in the field. And that can tell us whether or not we've got our abstractions right in a way that typically lab studies just can't do. This kind of problem-driven work, where we start with domain problem and do abstractions and then design idioms and then instantiate through algorithms, typically we call that problem-driven work, or sometimes design studies in visualization. So speaking of design studies, one useful methodology paper that you might find interesting is one that I wrote with two colleagues and postdocs after, between the three of us, we've done about over 20 of these over a 10-year period and tried to glean lessons from how it is you could do this kind of problem-centered work. We have a bunch of definitions to help you think, a framework that actually leads you through a process as opposed to the nested model, which is more thinking about validation approaches, and finally a set of pitfalls and some guidance on how to avoid them. So you might find value in having a look at that. Now let's talk about this data abstraction. So let's walk through this diagram piece by piece. Start out with major data hits. There are three major kinds of data that we deal with in visualization, and one of them is tabular data. What could you put in a spreadsheet in the simple case of a flat file? And we'll call the columns attributes. Some people might call them variables or dimensions or a number of other words. We're going to call them attributes here. And we'll call the items in this table, the rows in this table, items. Some people might call them observations. There's a lot of different terms across different domains. So we'll be using attributes and items. And then, of course, in a cell in this table, there's a value. We'll talk about more complex data types as we get to that later. But what else is there? Can you do everything in a spreadsheet? The answer is no. It's sometimes very useful to think about network data, by which I mean not just items, but the relationships between them. The vocabulary we often use here is that we think of, we call items nodes in this network, and then we think about links between the nodes. And trees are a special case of networks. Sometimes these are called graphs. That's a bit of a confusing word since we also use the word graph to mean chart. So most of the time in this tutorial, I'll use the word network. Finally, there's spatial data. Spatial data is so important that it gets a category all of its own. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why as we progress in this tutorial. So what I'm going to call a spatial field is where you have some continuous phenomenon that you're measuring or simulating, and you are regularly sampling at different positions in space to find out these values, these measurements. For example, you might be in a room, you might have a bunch of places where you are sampling the temperature, or the direction of the airflow, or the magnitude of the airflow, for example. So again, we have this idea of attributes, but we're finding these attributes at positions in space. And then there's also just purely geometric data, like the curve of the outline of a country or a county or a city. That's actually geometric data that we might need to show. Now you might wonder, if you're a computer graphics person, hey, in graphics we have geometry and we need to create images. What's the difference between graphics and visualization? My rule of thumb is that if your geometry is the result of a design decision, not simply given to you and used without any other consideration, design decisions are really what make this visualization. And we'll be talking about those design decisions over the course of this tutorial. So we've talked about data set types. Now let's talk about attribute types. Remember, we've got those columns in the table, and we've got those, they're also in the spatial data, and attributes can be associated with networks, either the links or the nodes. So what's interesting about attribute types? Well, the key thing is, do we have order or not? So categorical data doesn't have ordering. You know, apples versus bananas versus kiwi fruits. You know it's in that category or it's not. I'm going to call these different levels of the categorical variable or the categorical attribute, but we don't know an order. With ordered data, with purely quantitative data, we truly can. We could say, you know, the height of this tree is 20 feet, the height of that tree is 15 feet, and 20 minus 15 is 5. That number is a number we might actually use. So straight up quantitative data you can do arithmetic on. Some ordered data is not quantitative. We're going to call that ordinal. For example, a medium t-shirt is certainly between a small t-shirt and a large t-shirt, but you can't do arithmetic on them. It's not defined. With ordered data, we want to think about the semantics of it. Is there a minimum up to a maximum sequential value? Or is it semantically diverging, where there's a 0 point and we go up from there and we go down from there? Now, you could always have a mathematical transformation to go from one of those to the other, but we're interested in the underlying semantics. What's the meaning? This might require talking to the people in the domain if it's not something that already comes with the data in a way that's clearly articulated. So this is where we get into that back and forth, where there might be transformations of the data. We don't necessarily keep the attribute structure that we're given. The data might be cyclic. It might wrap around like days of the week or months of the year. That's another property of ordered data. So let's talk briefly about the why, now that we've seen a little bit of the what. So how can we have an abstract vocabulary for talking about the kinds of things people do? So one thing you might notice already from this diagram, although there's a lot there, and we'll be walking through it, on the left we've got actions, and on the right we've got targets. And if you look at a lot of descriptions of visualization, you'll see a lot of these action target verb-noun pairs, like discover a distribution, or compare trends, or locate outliers, or browse topology. So these are very common, and we're going to try to have a vocabulary of both the action verbs and the target nouns. So let's take a slightly closer look at that. So for the actions, well, we're thinking of a context where we're analyzing data, and you might consume existing data, either in discovery mode, as we talked about earlier, or presentation, or maybe even just out of sheer enjoyment. Baseball statistics, maybe that's not your day job, but you really want to investigate and visualize them. Maybe you don't just consume existing data, maybe you're producing data along the way. You might be annotating existing data, like with tags. You might be recording an analysis session, so you have the provenance for your decisions, or so that you could play it back later. And a really interesting one is you might be deriving new data so that you can visualize the appropriate thing. Another useful thing to consider is how much of the data matters to answer your analysis question. Do you just have to identify one thing or compare a few things to each other? Or do you actually need to have some sort of summary that crosses the entire data set? So that's also a very abstract way of thinking about your task. We aren't going to have time to talk about search today, so we'll just continue on. But what I do want to point out is that these two things cross-cut. The question of which kind of analysis you're doing is completely independent of which of these queries you're doing. So think of this as sort of a cross-product space. Let's get back to that question of deriving. What do I mean by deriving new data? This is a really important idea. We'll be talking about it a lot. So you don't necessarily just take a data set and draw what you're given. That's the easy case. The more complex and interesting and hard cases is that you have to decide what you need to show, and you might need to do a series of transformations from what you're given to actually come up with the right things, such that if you draw that picture, you'll help the person with their analysis questions. So it's one of the 4 major strategies for handling complexity. We'll get to the other 3 in a bit. But let's look at this one. Let's take, in fact, this comes back to the very first time line charts were ever even proposed by William Playfair. He was showing the exports versus the imports to Great Britain. And it's great that we're seeing a line chart. It's much better than staring at numbers, as we've already seen. But to actually understand the difference between the exports and the imports, you're actually doing a fair amount of work. You're having to compare these 2 lines and try to measure these 2 things. There's some systematic biases with how we look at these that makes this trickier. To make life easier, we could do the arithmetic already in advance and calculate this new value. We'll call that the balance of trade. And then we have that chart that we're seeing. Now that line actually directly tells us something that was much harder to get from those 2 lines independently. So that's an example of a local derivation where we do something simple. We just have one number minus the other. Let's look at a more complex example where we actually have to do a global calculation across the whole data set. So the Strahler number is one of many, many approaches to so-called centrality metrics of trying to figure out if you have a big complicated tree or network, which nodes are the most crucial and important ones. And we can derive this as a quantitative attribute. The use case we have is, what if we want to actually draw a skeleton of the tree? Let's say we have 500,000 nodes and we only have a very small amount of time to draw it because they're moving the mouse and interacting. So we want to draw a skeleton, and if we just drew the first 5,000 nodes in this huge data file, that picture we see on the left, it would probably just be that upper left corner where it's all red. We're actually color coding according to a traversal of the tree. So we don't just want to see a teeny bit. We want to carefully choose our 5,000 nodes to be the central skeleton like we see on the right. How would we know that? Well, we could go through and we can actually have a chain series of tasks where we start out by saying we're going to take this tree and we're going to calculate an attribute on each one of the nodes, this quantitative attribute, the so-called Strahler number of how central is a particular node. And then, as a second stage, we can go through and we can filter according to that quantitative attribute and then only look at the high-scoring nodes. So that's an example of where deriving new data was an important part of our visualization process. So now let's think about targets. So with Some targets actually happen across all data set. Everyone is always interested in finding trends and outliers. I'm using the word features for any kind of domain specific thing that we might want to talk about more generically and agnostically. Now, some questions about attributes are questions we can ask about a single attribute, like what's the distribution or the min and the max, to get the extremes of the distribution. But some questions we can ask depend on having multiple attributes. Is there a dependency between two attributes? Are two attributes correlated to each other? For multiple attributes, do we have some way of calculating similarity between them? So these are questions that intrinsically rely on having more than one attribute. Some kinds of things we do only are possible for certain kinds of data. Topological structure, how we jump from one node to the other, and how we follow a path through the network from node to link to node to link, that's a question we only ask about network data. This problem of understanding shape is something we typically only ask about spatial data. For spatial data, the shape can be a key question. What is the shape of this tumor or this tooth, or how does the wind flow over an airplane wing? These are all questions that come down to shape that are relevant for spatial data. If our data is not spatial, then we have choices about how to lay that data out in space. And so the shape is not intrinsic to the data, it's the choice of the designer. So we typically focus on shape exactly and only with spatial data. So that was a quick tour through the why and the what. There's many parts of the how. We're going to spend the rest of the tutorial actually talking through this. So this is just a sneak preview of that to give you a sense of where we're going. And for now, we're wrapping up the first segment. At the end of each of these, I'll have further reading lists. And then this snippet of the video will stop, and it's time for you to think about questions. Thanks. See you on the next round.